I'm joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor to go through some of the biggest stories in the news. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for joining me again.
Sure, happy to be with you.
We typically discuss war, but I want to bring this up. I see Democrats leaning further and further to the left and further away from their own voters. Democrats wanted a country full of illegals on U.S. citizens' dime. Democrats want illegals voting in election, but don't seem to listen to or care about what their voters want or need. Democrats want to transgender kids, even though parents are very much against it. Now you have Democrat leaders in Washington, D.C. They're flying to El Salvador to protest and demand and beg to free an immigrant connected to MS-13 gang. It turns out his wife filed a protective order against him because he was beating and physically assaulting her. Can you help me and my audience understand, how did Democrats become so anti-American and so anti their own voting base?
I think you're dealing with a group of people who are best characterized as anarchists, who are permanently at war with what they consider to be white America, Christian Americans, Christianity, and they see hope and salvation in the complete and utter destruction of the society in which they live. How do you do that? Well, you bring in, exactly as you pointed out, tens of millions of people that are coming in for various reasons, but are clearly not going to assimilate, probably can't assimilate, people we can't afford at a point in time when we've spent ourselves into oblivion. This is all designed to bring down our society. And I think their hope is that once the society collapses, the economy falls apart, the financial system fails, all of which are in the offing, in my judgment, in the near future, then they can move in and take over, much as the Bolsheviks did in the chaos that ensued after the removal of the Tsar. So I would see them as sort of anarchistic Bolsheviks. Now, as far as their base is concerned, I don't know what it is. Somebody needs to go and look very carefully at what they think the Democratic base is. I'm someone of the opinion that there is a majority of Americans, citizens, who are Republicans and Democrats who see things in very similar ways. They don't always know that each other exist, but both of them are largely fed up and disgusted with the two-party system and what's being delivered. And if you look at Trump right now, despite all the rhetoric and all the promises, he's largely extended Biden policies into the present. That's what's bad. The only potential bright spot at this stage is, yes, he's tried to clean up the border. In fact, that's where we went for the first episode of the show that we're producing, which is called Macgregor, by the way, for lack of anything else. And we discovered that, yes, the optics have improved dramatically, but the problem is that the legal entry points are the places where most of the illegal trafficking in drugs and human beings occur. Now, why would that be? Well, if you're a customs officer or you work there on a routine basis, you're paid anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 extra every month to let things go through, one way or the other. So the Border Patrol does its job. They patrol the border. They're arresting the few people that are still coming across. But if you've got that problem at legal crossing points, you're kidding yourself that the fentanyl is going to be stopped, or that the hundreds of thousands of people, women and children in particular, that go back and forth and disappear are suddenly going to stop. Now, again, the president has now sent federal troops to the border where there's federal land, but that's not enough. We need the entire border secured. And one of the things that I learned down there was, even though everybody's grateful for what the president has done, they would all like the United States Army to return to the border. And they point out, if you brought the Army down here, not only would you have ready reaction forces to deal with an increasingly well-armed and dangerous cartel militia on the other side, and bear in mind, when they said they were putting 10,000 Mexican troops on the border, well, they're paid by the cartels as well. So they're only going to do whatever the cartels tell them to do. And they said, what we really need is somebody who's going to come down here that's not going to be bribed. which means that you're going to have to rotate troops in and out of the legal crossing points every 30 to 45 days. If you leave people there for years, which is what happens on our border, you have the same people year after year after year, well, eventually they're going to surrender to the corruption. We have to understand that if you're paying someone maybe $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month after taxes, and suddenly this person is offered $20,000 to $30,000 in cash, no questions asked, no tax liability, nothing, eventually they're going to give up and they're going to submit or capitulate to the corruption. So that's a big problem on the border. And then, of course, we have an estimated 51 million illegals in the country. 31 million is what we were told when we were on the border, is what came in during Biden's administration. So you have 51 million inside the country. Nobody knows where they are. I mean, we know where some of them are. But you need a massive mobilization of resources. And whenever we have deported people, we deported 9 million Mexicans in 1929 and 1930 back to Mexico. That was to free up jobs for Americans. And Herbert Hoover, who was by no means an authoritarian or fascist or anything else, he was very concerned about the safety of non-citizens holding down jobs that citizens needed. So he said, we need to get them out. And so we deported 9 million. Under FDR, another 3.5 million were deported south to Mexico. Under Truman, another 2.2 million. And under Eisenhower, between 1.2 and 1.5 million. In each case, the United States Army was involved. General officers were appointed. They were given authorities. They were given regular troops, National Guard, and police. These were federalized assets, and they got the job done. If we're going to make a dent in the illegals that are already in the country, I'm talking about illegals, period. Anybody who broke our laws to come into the country, an illegal border crosser, you're probably going to have to deport 15,000 to 20,000 a day for many, many months. We're not even close. We're not even close. So I'm very happy that MS-13 types and other criminals are being picked up and shipped out. That's a good thing. But it's much bigger than that. It's much larger than that. And if we do nothing, these people will stay and they'll become a burden, particularly as we move deeper and deeper into recession. And I think that's where we're headed now. And there are all sorts of variables, so we can't predict how bad the recession will get. But, you know, if you listen to Ray Dalio, he's talking about a depression. So if that's true, what do we do with millions of people who are receiving free health care, food stamps, free government support, state and federal? Where are they going to go? Where are they going to live? We're providing them, in most cases, free housing. Out in California, they were providing them with breaks on interest rates for low interest loans. And these people aren't even citizens, in an attempt to permanently settle them in the country on the assumption this would indeed build a support base for the future dictatorship of the left in perpetuity. And when I say left, people have to understand today that's ambiguous, because this includes a lot of what people call rhinos on the right.
Okay. When you said we need to turn these people regularly, the longer they stay, the more corrupt they become. I thought you were talking about members of Congress and the need for term limits.
That's another problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a documentary on the border that's coming out soon?
Well, it's not really a documentary. It's as I said, it's a little more fast moving than that. We talked to a lot of people. There are a lot of good people down there on the border right now trying to do good things. A man and his wife, we talked to them, and they have been rescuing children from problems along the border. They actually found newborn children wrapped in some blankets and left at the border of the Rio Grande, just dropped. And they've opened up a facility, which is, privately funded, obviously, that's stocked now with food and beds and all sorts of medical support. So this woman and her husband are strong Trump supporters, by the way. They are trying to help people regardless of whom they are, whether they're headed north or south. And it's pretty frightening when you listen to what they discover. I had no idea that newborn children were simply being left out in the open in the wild.
Yeah. Ooh.
So it's a bad situation, and it needs to be dealt with directly. And the problem that I think I see with President Trump is very similar to what you see in most cases, and that is everybody wants to do things incrementally. Politicians don't like to be pregnant. They want to be a little pregnant to demonstrate that, yes, I'm doing something, but they don't want to bring the child to term because that's too unpopular, and that could upset their voters, and they might lose support and so forth. This is no time to worry about your standing in the polls or popularity. And he needs to take decisive action across the boards, not just about the border and border security, because now there's talk about taking, quote unquote, the war to the cartels. Well, good luck with that. First of all, you need to secure the border. The cartels penetrate all parts of American life. Whether you're in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Pennsylvania, California, the cartels are there. The illegal migration is inextricably intertwined with cartel criminality. So you've got to first and foremost stop the flow of drugs and people north, absolutely lock it down, and then you have to be prepared to fight the cartels inside the country, because if you really do your jobs and you cut them off from their income, which is billions of dollars, they're going to be at war with you. In fact, most people down on the border told me they're already at war with us, and we don't seem to pay any attention to it.
Okay. Yeah, that's been my concern is nobody likes to have their income go down. Nobody likes to have their source of income cut off. And so my worry has always been, how are they going to retaliate? It'll be really interesting to see. In the past, my understanding is, some of those groups, they just decided to get into avocados, and that's where they directed their money. But this is a new level of cartel that they have realized how much money is in trafficking humans versus drugs. And I hate to say this, it's gross, but how much money is in trafficking children? We find it disgusting. They find it a great source of income, and they're not going to want that cut off easily.
Well, remember that you're also talking about a flood of money. Nothing happens in the Department of Homeland Security, inside the FBI, the Justice Department, local and state police, without the cartels knowing it. They just have a lot of money. It's not that difficult to go out and recruit informants for yourself. The other thing is, I was recently down in southern Kentucky, and I was struck by the enormous numbers of Mexican restaurants. And I said, is Mexican food down here really that popular in southern Kentucky? And they all laughed, and they said, Doug, that's where the money is laundered by the cartels. So these Mexican restaurants popping up all over the place are not there just because everybody loves Mexican food. And by the way, I do. I think it's great. But it's another way to do business. And then you say, well, what about the local authorities? Don't the police know about this? Oh, of course. Well, why don't they do anything? Well, it takes all of about 60 seconds to figure out why. They're paid off. If you have enough money, and they do, there's not much they can't buy.
Wow. Well, I believe that. Okay, let me switch gears with you. In your estimation, where are we at with this ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia? Because it seemed like for a while the United States felt like this was heading towards a ceasefire. Then Ukraine launches missiles deep into Russia. Then, we apologize, it looks like the ceasefire's back on. Then Russia attacks a Ukraine city on Palm Sunday. Where do you think we're at?
Well, first of all, everyone needs to go back and look at the preconditions for any sort of peace agreement that the Russians have stipulated for months and months and months. They're very straightforward: denazification, neutralization, a legitimate leadership in Kiev, and ultimately neutrality for Ukraine. Now, there is no legitimate government today in Kiev. This is a criminal regime. that canceled elections, that's put itself permanently into power and is kept there by a vicious, corrupt, and dangerous secret police establishment. If you simply listen to what this Ukrainian regime says and about the Russians and then apply it to the Ukrainians, then you get the truth. I mean, you're dealing with a regime that has shut down all political opposition parties. You're dealing with a regime that has taken direct action against churches, particularly the Orthodox Christian Church. They've set up an attempt to build a phony church that is obedient to them and is divorced from Russia, when in reality that's never been fully sanctioned or recognized anywhere. But again, people have been paid off and certain things have happened. I think the problem we're up against is that no one really listens to the Russians. And then we walk in and say, well, let's have a ceasefire. The Russians say, to what purpose? And we say, well, to stop the killing. Well, as far as they're concerned, a ceasefire, based on their experience, simply presents an opportunity to the Ukrainians to rapidly rebuild, reconstitute, and renew the fight. In the meantime, we continue to supply hundreds of millions, billions of dollars worth of equipment and ammunition and cash to the Ukrainians, even though it's widely admitted that everything we give them, about 50% of it is either resold on the black market or disappears into the hole of corruption. But we continue to send money there, which really raises some tough questions about who the hell is sitting in Congress and insisting on this. I don't think there's any chance for us to have much impact anymore. And the reason I say that is very simply because President Trump walked in, thought he was going to wave his hand, peace would break out, and he would be viewed widely as this great purveyor of goodness and stability. Well, that's not the way it works. You have to sit down and you have to listen to what both sides are saying, but most important to the Russians. Now, has President Trump achieved anything that's good with the Russians thus far? I would say yes. I think that we've made a lot of progress towards normalization of our relations with the Russians, particularly in business and commerce. And I think that's a very good thing. It could still be destroyed by people in Washington who have a permanent interest in hostility to Russia. But as far as the Ukraine business is concerned, no. I think the Russians have discovered that we're not going to listen to them. We're not going to take their legitimate security interests seriously. So they're going to press ahead until this beast is dead that lives in Kiev. And it's getting closer every day. I think by the time they're through, you'll have the Dnieper River as a border between eastern Ukraine under Russia and western Ukraine that will be neutral. And all the talk about the British or the French or someone else going into western Ukraine with troops is sheer unadulterated nonsense, because none of the Europeans can do anything without us. They have essentially neutered themselves militarily over the years by not just by spending too little money, but creating the wrong force for national defense. They've been focused on little interventions in Africa and the Middle East, places like this where they can play colonial master again, the British, the French, to a lesser extent, the Dutch, the Belgians. So they have no real forces to send in. They don't have access to our command control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that's space-based or even terrestrially based. In other words, they can't fight a real war against anybody right now. A friend of mine in the French army said, Doug, the only thing the French army is organized to do right now is go on safari in Africa. So I think the Russians will fight this to the bitter end. They're not in any great hurry. They've moved very slowly because they don't want to take casualties unnecessarily. So if they run into a hard point of resistance, they'll back up. They'll carefully isolate it, establish who's in it, give these people a chance to surrender, and if they don't, they'll annihilate them with overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower. Then they'll move through and go on to the next objective. That's where they're doing business, and the Ukrainians have no chance whatsoever against them because they are unable to do the things tactically or operationally that the Russians are doing.
Yeah, I'm not going to take time to look it up, but remember in Congress when all the Democrats were waving the Ukraine flag. They had just voted against something that would help the American people, but then they were waving their Ukraine flags. Do you think Trump is afraid to cut off money and weapons to Ukraine because it might trigger an impeachment? Or I don't know. I feel like Zelensky is kind of leading him around by the nose.
Well, Zelensky is part of a three-legged stool. You have Zelensky in Kiev, you have Netanyahu in Israel, and then you have New York City and Washington, the powerful moneyed elites that want war with Russia, and they want war in the Middle East against whomever the Israelis don't like. That's a very powerful triangle politically for President Trump. There's only one way to deal with this sort of thing. It's like, you remember as a child, you were cut or something, and your mother took the bandage and ripped it off. Well, he refuses to rip it off. He's trying to pull it up carefully, step by step. That just prolongs the agony. And somebody said, well, how do you stop Netanyahu? Well, you stop sending him weapons and arms and money. That's very simple. He's through if you can't get access to that. He could do nothing without us. Well, then how do you stop Zelensky? You stop aid, money, cash, equipment. He can do nothing without us. I mean, that's the answer is that simple. But right now, we're unwilling to do either, which presents us with the real possibility that despite good intentions, and I do not doubt President Trump's intentions. I know him, not as well as some other people, but I got a chance to appreciate him up at close range, and I know he's very sincere, and I know he doesn't want war. But that's not enough.
Yeah, it's like he can't quite untangle himself, and yet, Steve Witkoff was over negotiating with Russia, tends to say, Russia wants to end this, but they want certain parameters met, and but again, I see Zelensky as the one that wants to keep this thing going. You had once said something to the effect on my show that Russia has been made into this evil boogeyman in order for the military-industrial complex to justify this large military spending in America. Is that also true of Europe? Did they make Russia this big, bad, evil boogeyman in order to justify their spending on military stuff?
I think in Europe, it's a little more complex. I think you're dealing with this globalist ruling class. What are the globalist objectives? They want regional or world government. They want to eliminate borders. They want to destroy national identity. They want to homogenize Europe into an amorphous mass of people who are obedient to whatever they want them to do. That's the simplest explanation I can come up with. It's failed. The Europeans don't want that any more than we do. They're fed up. They're disgusted. And I think now that the lies are beginning to see daylight, people are beginning to figure out that they have been systematically lied to about a whole range of things, not the least of which is about Russia. The elites say this is our last chance. If we can't convince people that Russia is an enemy and that Russia is the cause of our misfortunes, the populations will eventually turn to us and say, you bankrupted us. You destroyed our economies. You embraced all these conditions for Russian cooperation that were never necessary. Russia is not interested in invading us. Russia wants to do business with us. Now, once that becomes increasingly clear, people like Starmer and Macron and this new man Merz in Berlin, who is just another version of Merkel, only in male clothing, these people are going to be gone. They'll be gone quickly. And that's what they're afraid of. You're going to see nationalist revolutions break out simultaneously or near simultaneously all over Europe as people finally figure out these people don't care about us. They're about themselves. And usually this comes about as a result of financial collapse, economic difficulty. Everybody forgets that the French Revolution really gets off the ground when the population of Paris can no longer afford to buy bread. The prices were so inflated, nobody had the money. And that was the beginning of the revolution. Now, the ideas behind the revolution had been there for decades. People saw all the evidence for decay, criminality, corruption, and so forth. And we don't need to go through the whole historical example, but their economy and their financial system was destroyed. Everybody saw that, but it really hit home when people couldn't afford to buy bread. Well, you're nearing something similar to that in Great Britain, especially in England. I think you're going to see it in many countries. You're not going to see it in Hungary, obviously, where the Hungarian president says this is all nonsense. It's never going to happen. There's Slovakia. I think the Slovaks have joined with the Hungarians and says this is crazy. We don't want anything to do with this. Eventually, it'll happen in more countries in Central East Europe, I think. I think eventually in Austria, the Austrians will say this is nuts and move away from it. But then again, remember that the globalists, as soon as you say I'm a nationalist and I care about my country and my concern for my country means that you should be removed because you've bankrupted us and destroyed our society, oh, well, then you're a Nazi. It's all this crap that, you're something evil because you're opposed to me. Well, come on over to the United States and what do you face? Somebody stands up and says, you have no right to crush my freedom of speech. Oh, but you're a Nazi. That's why you can't speak. Well, what makes me a Nazi? Well, you made the following comments that we don't like. This is nonsense. This is not going to work here either. Eventually, given the economic conditions, the whole thing is going to explode. And I think we're getting closer and closer to it each day. I think I may have mentioned this on previous shows. An easy indicator of just how dangerous and fragile our financial situation is to go and look at the Treasury market. See, the way we have done business for many, many years is, first of all, you got to keep the dollar weak, but consumption in the United States strong. When the dollar is weak and consumption is strong, all the cheap goods pour into the United States. People buy them. The money goes to China or Japan or Korea or somewhere else. That money then flows into the Treasury market. In other words, they invest their hard-earned income in the United States, and the cycle begins again. You understand? That cycle's dying. The external capital inflows aren't happening. So when the Chinese and the Japanese, by the way, the Japanese are the largest holders of our debt, external to the country, when they are dumping treasuries and they are not sending their money to the markets here, what does that mean for us? That means that we have to print more money as a stopgap. Well, we've reached a point now where we can't do that much longer without crashing the whole system. And I think that's where we're headed. The system is going to crash. You don't need to be a PhD in economics to see that. I'm simply saying, Ray Dalio has a point. You can look at, Ricards is another one, Jim Ricards. There are all sorts of people out there. They're all saying more or less the same thing. And Alistair McLeod in the gold markets. Everybody is more or less saying the same thing. This can't go on much longer. But there is no easy solution. And the right solution is to stand up as president of the United States and say, first, we've got to cut military spending by 50%. We're talking about $1 trillion budget. And we already have, a $37 trillion national sovereign debt. And we're borrowing how many trillions every year just to cover our existing expenses? We've got to cut spending. It's not going to be the sole answer. But if we're going to get anywhere, we have to demonstrate our ability to cut spending. And the military expenditures need to be cut by 50%. Well, if you cut it by 50%, you're going to have a tough time waging war all over the world against everybody. And of course, the argument will be, well, if we leave, the world will collapse. No, it won't. It's been there for thousands of years. It'll be there when we're gone. What counts is what happens here. And that should have been the focus from day one. If you're going to be an American firster, be an American firster. The second thing is you've got to admit that for people under 50, they're never going to see Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. They all have to be revised, revamped, reorganized. We need to go to new systems of doing things. And if we're going to do these things, 50 million illegals need to leave. That's the whole point. What are we spending money on them for? We ought to be spending money on Americans. And we haven't even talked about the educational system. Yeah, get rid of the Department of Education. It's been a catastrophe. I don't dispute that. But education itself in the United States has to change. If you spend time in a place like Japan or Korea or somewhere else, you will see the educational systems are very different from ours. We need to look at what works because what we have doesn't. When you're graduating, 20%, 30% of a high school graduating class is functionally illiterate, not in every city, but in major cities and so forth. Who are we kidding? So all of these things have to be addressed head on. We need to deal with them in a very straightforward manner. But that takes a lot of guts, and it takes a lot of organization. It takes strategy and planning. We have no strategy. We have no plan. Everything is impulsive.
Yeah. One thing I have found interesting that I think Trump is doing that's different is in the past, administrations have tried to make America look stable and solid, and we pay our bills so that they'll buy those treasuries. And I feel like Trump is going outside of the system, and he's saying, invest directly in American businesses, bring businesses back, like SoftBank of Japan, $200 billion, but they didn't put that into treasuries. They're putting that into AI chips and supercomputers and different things like that. So it's been interesting to see his focus more on investing in things that will create jobs versus investing in a government that may or may not be able to pay its bills.
Well, you have to be able to squeeze out investment inside the United States. How do you squeeze out investment if the economy is shrinking? You already have a very small manufacturing sector. In fact, someone was pointing out to me there are three things that we export. We export agricultural products. For the sake of simplicity, we'll call those bushels. We export energy, natural gas, oil, and so forth. Let's call that barrels. And then we execute military, we develop and we export military equipment and ammunition. So let's call that bombs. So bushels, barrels, and bombs. That's it. That's what we export. Now, if you say, China, I'm angry with you because you're doing so well, we're doing so poorly, and it's got to be your fault. And the Chinese will laugh and say, yeah, we came to the United States. We forced you to sell your manufacturing base and bring it to China. Of course they didn't. Greedy members of your so-called ruling class, the billionaires that currently govern us in Washington and own the Hill, those are the people that sold us out. They didn't care. So the Chinese, yes, they have a brilliant manufacturing sector. They have a manufacturing sector that may be the largest in history. They are where we were in 1945, 46, 47, 48. They are enormous. We can't compete. We can't compete because, first of all, the human capital that we have needs to be improved. We need to reduce spending. We need to invest wisely. You can't simply say, well, come to Nevada and build microcircuitry there. The first question is, who's going to work there? How well educated they are? Can you provide us with the right kind of labor? Secondly, who's going to build the factory? How do we do that? You want us to spend all this money to build a factory in your country. Where's the payoff for us? In other words, it's fine to say those things, but as you point out, the Japanese have no incentive to come here and build anything. They can do it cheaper, faster, better with better labor elsewhere. So we've got serious problems of our own. These things are not going to be turned around quickly. And then when you add to it this enormous national sovereign debt that we've just piled up year after year after year because no one wants to admit that our high standard of living is artificially financed. It's not based on productivity. What do we build that other people want and need? And I told you, energy, agriculture, that's it. The bad news for us is if you tell China, we're not going to sell you any more agriculture or agricultural products or energy, Chinese will shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's fine. They'll go elsewhere. I mean, Russia sitting next door has huge quantities. Everyone is willing to do business with China. China is making it easy for the world to do business with them. Everyone wants access to their markets. And President Trump says, we're the greatest market in the world. Everybody needs us. Not anymore, Mr. President. That may have been true 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. But over the last 10 years, things have changed dramatically. And now that you've embraced this tariff war on everyone, trying to punish everyone who doesn't do as we tell them, things are much worse. And remember, starting back in 2017, 2018, the Chinese began looking at the landscape, as many others have, and said, it's time for us to build new supply chains. This Belt and Road Initiative is designed to build alternatives to reliance on seaport. In other words, we can't transport by sea as we once did because there's this thing called the U.S. Navy that could interfere with us, disrupt us, or stop us. Well, that's fine. We'll build all the way across Central Asia and all the way into Africa this vast new network. And this network with high-speed rail is going to be able to deliver everything that people want that we make. I mean, the world has really changed, but we don't seem to understand just how much it has changed.
Yeah.
And we're going to eat a lot of humble pie, I suspect, in the near future.
Whew. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for coming on. I always
sure about that.
Well, hey, I like to get perspective from everybody. I'm young enough to know I don't know very much, so it's good to hear from all different walks of life. If people want to continue to hear from you, where can I point them to follow you online?
Well, I think first of all, you Google my name, all sorts of things will come up, most of which are pretty valid. I'm the co-chairman now of Our Country, Our Choice. I am connected loosely to Republic, the New Republic platform, which I encourage everybody to look for, see what it does. And also we have a new program that's going to be starting in May. We tried to do it in April, but it was just too soon. And it's going to be, I think, a program of great interest. Our first episode is about the border and immigration. The episode after that is on this business of war. When do you go to war? When do you not go to war? And then the one after that will be about, I think, religion in America. Do we have a moral compass at all anymore? What guides us in our thinking and behavior at home as well as abroad? And the one after that's going to deal with making America healthy again. We're going to look very carefully at all the alternatives to the bad food and bad water we've been drinking and the efforts of many people like RFK Jr. and others to address these things. So that gives you a sort of a taste of where we're headed. And we're going to bring on some interesting guests, some of whom will be very well known. Others will be new, people you haven't heard from before. And I think it's probably a mix somewhere between Tucker Carlson Tonight and 60 Minutes. In other words, we wanted to have some depth and foundation, but we also want to keep it moving and interesting. So we'll see how it goes. It's just called at the moment, Macgregor. I'll probably have a co-host, although we're still, trying several, potential co-hostesses out. But and somebody said, well, why don't you call it Macgregor Unhinged? And everybody in the office said, why bother? He's already unhinged. So we'll see. I think it'll be fun for people, but we want to get to the truth, whatever that is, however ugly it may be. It doesn't make any difference. Yeah, we'll take no prisoners in the fight for the truth. That I promise.
Okay, well, I look forward to it. I love those deep dives that open my eyes and teach me new things. So I'm going to put those links down below so that people can get there easily. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll have you on in the future. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks very much, Stephen. Bye-bye.